Hello and welcome to week 14 of Race and Ethnicity. This is a very exciting week. This week you're going to be talking about color blindness, you're going to be looking at multiculturalism and also racial democracy. So when you go to think about color blindness, this is the idea that people think that racial injustice is a thing of the past and no longer does racism exist. As we can see, as evidenced by income disparity, educational attainment disparity, social justice issues such as police, stereotyping, letting white people off with more lenient sentences than African Americans, for example, institutional discrimination that exists with jobs, and the way that we like we talked about last week, things like how race affect things that, who you marry and things along those lines, you'll begin to see that this idea that race and racism is not a thing of the past, that race in itself is constantly affecting how we identify as people, and it's affecting how we interact socially, and it's also affecting our access to be able to rise up the social class ladder, for example. So when you look at color blindness, that's the idea of colorblind racism. It's this idea that we think racism is gone, but it is not gone. Then in contrast to that, we have this embracing of diversity in the form of multiculturalism. And multiculturalism is recognizing that diversity exists and that each person is very unique in their own forms of diversity. And even when you get into theories of the personality and theories of the self, a lot of the ways that you define who you really are is in contrast to other people, for example. So this is the idea that not everyone should be looked at as the same so much, but maybe we should look at, and embrace all forms of diversity and recognize that people are not the same. That's a very interesting take. Then you have this idea of racial democracy, which contrasts both of those two, and that even if you have multiculturalism, for example, systematic institutional discrimination still exists. So we need to not only change the meaning of race, okay, and the negative stereotypes attached to race, for example, and the power structure attached to race because, your race and your sex, for example, dictate where you're located in the social class system. We should create a more equitable world for all. We should take into account all these little forms of prejudice and discrimination and also tear down those walls. So symbolically, as we interact and we attach meanings and socialize our children, what it means to be different, to be diverse, it's the way that we teach these concepts. And then it's the way as we as a society systematically use power and privilege to oppress other groups of people. And it's not very meritocratic. So therefore, we need to be tearing down these institutions that encourage prejudice and ensure discrimination exists in modern times. Okay, so that's the first part. You guys are going to read chapter 11 on colorblind racism, on multiculturalism and racial democracy. And then you're going to take the quiz on chapter 11. Then also this week, we're going to have a great discussion board. So if you look down at the bottom, how to bring racial equality discussion board. So for this, you're going to write a 300-word discussion saying, what do you think is the most important goals for creating racial equality, and how do we create the change necessary to move toward racial equality? So for me, for example, I always talk about stop calling yourself white or black. These are inaccurate ways to group people, maybe, and that's one way. Just stop using racial words at all, stop identifying with races, and then it has no longer any meaning. Another way is to keep your races, but then change the meanings attached to those races, okay? So that you have, less inequality, less negative stereotypes. We're more free to interact with different groups. This idea of in-group versus out-group shifts, okay? So we no longer have out-groups based upon whether or not their race matches ours, for example, all of which are harmful and limit our interaction, for example, okay? So what do you guys think? So you want to write 300 words about that. Then you have to respond to 3 other students with at least 50 words in the response. And I always try to further the discussion as much as possible, talk about some of the key points they might have talked about. What does that make you think about? And then write about that, okay? So if you have any questions, please email, and have an exceptional week. Thank you.